Justice Belinda Ang, Chairperson of the Singapore Mediation Centre, Judges of the Supreme Court, Professor Lily Kong, President of Singapore Management University, SMU, Mr. Philip Fong, Managing Partner of Eversheds, Harry Elias, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me here today. I will literally, if you look at the title, it's a voyage across the world of mediation, across the different countries and so on, and I'm taking the title quite seriously and quite literally as well, as you will see. Following the title, to focus on what we have done in the past, to give some light as to where we are now, how we see the landscape, and then look at where we think the key drivers of mediation should be. And the broad theme of what I'm going to say would be, we have had a significant milestone in having the Mediation Convention signed in Singapore. It's something I will cover. But it will be very foolish to rest on those laurels. We, in typical Singapore fashion, need to find the next bound, the next step forward, and I think we need to look at the drivers of mediation around the world to tell us what then we should focus on. 2019, as I mentioned earlier, has indeed been a momentous, if not historic year for mediation. We are very proud to have hosted the historic signing of the Singapore Convention on Mediation on the 7th of August, and I know many of you were there. 70 countries attended, which itself is testament to the support that we had, not just for the practice of mediation, but I would dare say for the support of Singapore as a trusted platform, trusted legal system, one that people believe in and have confidence in, and are prepared to bring the disputes here for Singapore to resolve. 46 countries signed up to the mediation. When we started the convention, we asked the UN, how many do we need to make this a convention? They said 3. I said, okay, we can do that. It's just one ourselves and 2 others. And so we went out, our staff went out, we made it a concerted effort within the government. Every time any office holder traveled, we made it a point to put it on the agenda to remind people about not just the fact that it is a Singapore Convention on Mediation, which of course is important, but because mediation is actually the way in which businesses would like to see the business disputes resolved. And I would suggest that as we make my way through this lecture, that much of the support that the countries have showed us is really a reflection of their own business community, how their own business people see the value of mediation within their own countries. And I would suggest that that has what led to the overwhelming support that we had for the Mediation Convention. So 46 countries of the 70 signed up to it. Since the convention took place in August, 5 more had come on board. So we are now at 51. So back in 2017, negotiations in the UN were very intense. And we had a team up there, almost permanently stationed there to deal with the negotiations, to bring the parties together. And then there was a very harsh North American blizzard. It shut down the whole UN headquarters, snow everywhere, nobody could move around. Delegates that were involved in the negotiations for the purposes of getting the convention done were all stuck either in their hotels or elsewhere and just could not access the meeting rooms at the UN HQ. So they decided to find an alternative venue. And with the blizzard, once they got in, they couldn't get out. And they didn't get out until they found consensus on what the convention looked like. And so this is where we are today. So even in those early days, there was a hallmark of the good qualities of a mediation, or rather qualities of a good mediation. You had an unanticipated scenario, and then you had an innovative solution. You needed to get everyone together to find a solution, and you locked them up. So in the end, what started off in this fashion ultimately ended up with the convention. It's been hard work to get the negotiations done. We're very happy that it is done. But as I mentioned right at the start, we now sit perhaps at a point of inflection. Having done it, having put it in motion and have a very good start, we are now, of course, embarking on ratification as we are persuading other countries as well. We also only need 3 to ratify for it to be effective. I think we can achieve that. But the key is, how do we now move forward? How do we not keep on referring to August 2019 and say we've done this? How do we make sure that we can leverage on the goodwill we have generated, the thought leadership that we have shown in this space, and how do we make sure that mediation not just becomes something that is commonplace, as common as litigation and arbitration, but also a way in which we can help businesses resolve their disputes. So I look at it from the perspective of the past, what we have done in the developmental process, the present, where we are today in the legal landscape, and perhaps most importantly, have a glance at the future and see where that might take us by looking at the trends. People say you look at the past to tell the future. It's true to some extent. But also importantly, how the legal industry can work together, how the different facets of mediation, the different institutions, the different leaders of mediation in our community all can come together. So let me start with the past. Mediation actually is not something that is new, especially in our deep, rich Asian context. Migrants from South China used to resolve commercial and non-commercial disputes through negotiations with their clans. In fact, many of them still do today. They go to a clan elder, one who is respected, one who is able to speak to both parties in a neutral, impartial way to find a common ground and to find a way to resolve the disputes. Still being done today, but it started in those days. The Malay communities, in turn, had their own village head. And likewise, the Indian communities had community leaders called panchayats, if I pronounce it correctly, who played the same role as well. On an institutional level, our efforts to reintroduce mediation as an alternative dispute resolution mechanism started in the 1990s. And those of you who were practicing litigation then would know, I was a young litigator then, came out of school, went into practice, wanted to resolve everything by fighting, because that's what we were taught to do in litigation. And then we went to pre-trial conference, and the judge kept asking us, have you had mediation done? Have you tried to settle this case? And it was, of course, anathema to someone like me who didn't have much experience. But I think looking back now, I think that those days when we started it by institutionalizing mediation in the context of, obviously, litigation. Mediation doesn't exist in vacuum. It exists when there's a dispute. So it's a natural place to start. But apart from that, I think mediation was also useful from a societal setting. If you look at Singapore, we are densely populated. We live in a city-state. Neighbors are close to each other. We have a community, a society that is multicultural, multi-religious. We have different backgrounds. We respect our religions in different ways. One of the early boosts we had was really the support from the judiciary and how mediation was integrated into the domestic dispute resolution system from the early days. And in fact, it became institutionalized in pre-trial conferences and formalized in 1996, where parties were encouraged, some more forcibly than others, to resolve it by negotiations. And then, of course, in 94, the court-based mediation in the state courts, or what is known as court annex mediation, in 94 started. And that, again, gave a tremendous boost to mediation in the context of dispute resolution and litigation. Government also played its part, and looking at the landscape in 96, convened a committee on alternative dispute resolution, looking at the different means by which disputes could be resolved, and how it could be implemented, promoted, and implemented beyond just in the court setting. And these recommendations came very quickly. In 97, the Singapore Mediation Center was set up. And very quickly, a year after that, the Community Mediation Center started to operate. The CMC started off as really a grassroots-led initiative, where grassroots leaders within communities would be called upon from time to time to resolve disputes. And CMC gave them a platform, a setting, and as well as the training. SMC has grown from strength to strength, as I mentioned earlier. It's handled many cases referred by the Supreme Court. More than 4,000 cases were referred to the SMC. So they achieved a high settlement rate of 70%, and more than 90% of cases were settled within one working day. You need to find that a common ground in the midst of so much conflict and antagonism to build a bridge across. And of course, you need staying power, literally. On top of that, SMC also raised awareness of mediation. So it's not just about when you get into court and when you have lawyers being encouraged to go to SMC, but also going out to the community, the business people, explaining what mediation is all about, explaining the value of mediation and the benefits that it can have. Beyond domestic mediation, we then went on to develop international commercial mediation. So we took it one level beyond that and tried and looked at how we can harness the learning that we had. If you remember, SIAC at that time was developing as well into the international center that it is today. At that point in time, late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a rise in cross-border commercial activities and transactions. Parties needed fair, efficient, transparent way, quick as well, to resolve disputes, helping business partnerships, supporting trade and commerce, and ultimately preserving the harmony and the relationship. That's, I think, the true value of mediation. The other value of mediation, of course, is in preserving the harmony and relationship, and that's not to be underestimated, because today's contracts are large, huge contracts that last a long time, sometimes even beyond the lifespan of a single management team. So goodwill that's been built up over so many years should not be so easily lost over one dispute. And that's a theme that keeps recurring. And later on, when I talk to you about the infrastructure dispute resolution protocol, that's the thinking behind an initiative like that. But let me just give some case study examples just to illustrate the point very quickly. There's a dispute between a Korean party and an American party, but it was a joint venture where the Korean party was a minority shareholder running the business, and the parties accused each other of breaching terms of the shareholders' agreement and so on, the usual. At the mediation, parties were very entrenched in the position until the mediator then explained that as shareholders, whatever is the outcome of this arbitration, this dispute, you will remain as shareholders. At this point in time, it's not an oppression suit, not a buyout. You're going to get remedies either for damages for breach of this joint venture term or that and so on. But the end result is that you remain as shareholders. In the end, Americans decided to buy out the shares of the Korean party, and to ensure that they were able to preserve the harmony, the payment was staggered and so on. But one key ask from the Korean side was, after selling out, they wanted to make sure that the staff was not let go of, that they continued to retain and had a job. And that became a term of the mediation, that the Americans buying over the Koreans would retain the staff for X period. And I think that eventually was the term that brought them over the barrier. Along with the development of SMC and the internationalization, we then set up 3 complementary entities. And they are the SIMC, obviously, providing not just good administrative services, but I think taking a leaf out of what was done at SIAC to ensure that the panel of mediators who sat at SIMC would be the best that anyone can find in the world. SIMI, Singapore International Mediation Institute, was set up at around the same time as a professional self-regulatory body to set standards and provide accreditation for mediators. Again, an important part of the ecosystem. Much as you want to develop the business side of mediation to ensure more cases, to develop the expertise, I think we have to make sure that the capability of mediators, competency, and the ability to always be ahead of the curve, knowledge-wise, is preserved. And SIMI plays that role. Finally, the Singapore International Dispute Resolution Academy, SIDRA. It drives academically robust thought leadership research and complements Singapore's suite of dispute resolution services and training. So an academy that helps to oversee international dispute resolution. All that was the landscape that has taken us into where we are today. In 2017, we enacted the Mediation Act to enhance the enforceability of mediated settlement agreements. So even before the Mediation Convention, for domestic mediation, we already had a framework to ensure that mediated agreements could become enforceable under the Mediation Act, to provide the parties on a cross-border basis the ability to go to one mechanism and say, if I've signed up to mediation, this is my enforcement mechanism. We have also built on the success of Maxwell Chambers, first built 2009, I think it was, 9 or 10 years ago, and 2 months ago we launched or opened up Maxwell Chambers Suites, which provides now 3 times the size in terms of facilities for hearings and so on. It also provides a hub for so many world-leading institutions. SIAC is there. Permanent Court of Arbitration, PCA, is there. ICC is there. AAA is there. INSOL recently became the newest tenant in there. All of this, I think, creates an ecosystem of thought leadership, of dispute resolution ecosystem that plays off each other. In the 5 years since SIMC was established, they've had over 80 cases to date. Settlement rate as of end of 2018 was at over 80%, which is significantly above the global settlement rate of 70%. And it has expanded its footprint through many international collaborations as well, signing MOUs with foreign dispute resolution institutions in countries like China, India, Japan, South Korea. 3 of these 4 countries eventually signed up to the convention. We're also developing new products and services, or at least prior to the SCM, it was very popular for the Up-Met-Up protocol to be adopted. It needed to be done in the days pre-convention because you wanted to then leverage on the New York Convention for the arbitration award for it to be enforceable. But of course, today with the SCM, we don't need to have a separate route into the New York Convention. There's also the SIDP, I mentioned that earlier, Singapore Infrastructure Dispute Management Protocol for infrastructure projects that was introduced last year. And it has a couple of novel features. The thinking behind this is that if you look at by all accounts, infrastructure spend is going up in Asia. Money is coming into Asia, in particular and also in Southeast Asia, for investments to build roads, to build transport services, airports. These infrastructure projects tend to be long-term, and they tend to be large-scale, high-value. And we wanted to make sure that these projects would have the best chance of succeeding, even if there might have been a dispute arising at some stage in the project. So the SIDP protocol takes a proactive dispute resolution mechanism. So it tries to resolve a dispute or be there to resolve the dispute even before the dispute has arisen. The protocol also provides a wider range of methods, including mediation. So SIDP also works with SIMC, or rendering an opinion, or making formal determination, or neutral evaluation. So it's fairly flexible, but the novelty behind the idea is to situate a body that helps the parties find conciliation even as the dispute arises. On a global stage, we've been recognized for our thought leadership, and I mentioned just now our role at UNCITRAL. We had to bring consensus across so many different thoughts, thinking, legal systems, and of course different interests. And I thought what we'll do is also to give me a break, we'll play a short video to showcase the mediation convention.
It gives me great pleasure to announce that the Singapore Convention on Mediation, to be signed shortly, will be the first UN treaty to have an orchid named after it. Very nice indeed, isn't it? That deserves a round of applause, doesn't it?
On behalf of the Secretary General of the United Nations, I declare open for signature the United Nations Convention on International Settlement Agreements Resulting from Mediation, to be known as the Singapore Convention on Mediation.
For those of you who were there, I think you know how proud we were at that moment. Everyone coming together, the whole legal community coming together, and so many ambassadors we had, goodwill ambassadors. The whole event was also helmed by so many youth ambassadors who were so proud of their own country. But as I said at the start, I think all that is now in the past. We now have to find a way to move forward, to bring this to fruition and to really leverage on what we have done in the Singapore Convention on Mediation. And so Let me offer a few suggestions. First, we must look at what are the drivers of growth and the opportunities which present themselves. Where in the sphere of mediation, in the context of dispute resolution, can we play a bigger role? And I will suggest that it is not just in terms of the subject matter, which you'll hear from me are infrastructure type projects and investor state projects, but also the geographical location where that can be done, where we can look at expanding beyond the boundaries of Singapore. We must ride decisively on these riders of growth and take the opportunities. So, as I mentioned earlier, investments will flow increasingly into Asia, especially with the Chinese renewed initiative on BRI. If you look at ASEAN's GDP, today ASEAN's GDP alone stands at about $3 trillion, and it grows at about annually, collectively at ASEAN's level, at about 5% annually. If you contrast that to the annual growth rate of GDP around the world, everyone else, is at 3.8%. So it tells us that the ASEAN focus, the Asian focus, is going to be strong in the coming years, in the next 5, 10, 15 years. To do this, we must strengthen our mediation network across the region, and if not the region, also globally. We must also embrace future legal trends and what kind of cases we think mediation might apply to in the future. So let me elaborate on these, starting with a survey that was done by SIDRA. But the recent survey is quite extensive, surveyed 300 corporates and external counsel on the use of dispute resolution mechanisms between 2016 and 2018, so in the period before SCM. It showed that arbitration remained the most commonly used dispute resolution mechanism, followed by the third bar is the international commercial litigation. So SIAC first, SICC next. Not surprising because this is pre-SCM days. Key reason behind it was the ability to enforce outcomes. Arbitral awards were obviously easier to enforce, had more confidence, and of course there's a track record of using the New York Convention over time. Hence, the lack of a mechanism for cross-border enforcement of mediated settlement agreements was a huge limitation. And I venture to suggest, if you just look at this additional slide here, is that beyond the original slide where you showed that arbitration and litigation was preferred, the reason for that is enforceability. Today with SCM, I think we should expect there to be a different outcome. So if enforceability was the inhibitor, with SCM, we think that will change. So with time, I think that trend will reverse. On top of that, if you look at the adoption by countries, I mentioned that we had started with 46, now it's at 51. We are also putting together the necessary legislation to ratify it as other countries. But what I think is also key would be the adoption by the corporates and the businesses. I mentioned earlier that I think the significant support by the countries coming forward to sign it is really a surrogate marker for their own country's business interests. Second, another driver of the adoption of mediation, as I said, is economic growth. And let me just give you some statistics to outline the point. Asia is now the fastest growing region. It's home to 28% of the world's middle class, which will increase to 2/3 by 2030. So not long from now, 10 years or so. And significantly, 70% by 2050. So in other words, 70% of the world's middle class is projected to be in Asia by 2050. So not only is that a large number, it's a significantly sharp ascent over the next 2 to 3 decades. Second, urbanization rate currently is at 48%. It'll increase to 55% by 2030 and 62% by 2050. I mentioned infrastructure demands, especially in ASEAN, is estimated to be about $1.7 trillion per year, each year, from 2016 to 2030. On legal services, between 2017 and 2020, the annual growth rate of legal services in the Asia-Pacific is expected to be about 6.6%. That number has to be contrasted with the expected global expansion of legal services, which stands at 3.4%. So the expansion of legal services, the growth of legal services in Asia Pacific is estimated to be almost double of that you will find around the world. And I take legal services to be a surrogate marker for business activity. The more business activity there is, the more you expect legal services to be on the rise. And then we have the elephant in the room, China and India, two large economies. China is the world's largest economy, contributing around 30% of the global growth in the past 8 years. India, already the third largest economy in terms of purchasing parity terms, and has a strong momentum of growth. Two other giants in Asia, South Korea and Japan. South Korean and Japanese companies are on the international scale. They make significant infrastructure investment in Southeast Asia. So if you take a step back and look at the signatories to the SCM, you have the two largest economies of the world, you have 3 of the 4 largest economies in Asia, and half of ASEAN, 5 countries out of the 10 in ASEAN signed up to it. As I said, I think I read this as a marker of activity, business activity within those countries, and their interest in using mediation as a way to resolve disputes. But I would go a little bit further and look at regions, not your typical regions, and look at Central Asia. So I visited Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan earlier this year. Kazakhstan, I'm happy to say we managed to persuade them to sign up to the SCM, whilst Uzbekistan felt they were not ready yet, but they attended the convention to show their support. And I believe that the demand for dispute resolution services in these regions will only grow as the economies mature, as more investments go in, as more infrastructure work takes place, they will only grow. Overlaying all of that is what I said at the outset, that mediation is a culture that is a value that is very much embedded in the Asian way of doing business. And not only is this something that we hear firsthand, sometimes anecdotally, sometimes through your own dealings in these jurisdictions, but if you look at a SIDRA survey, preservation of business relationship is a top reason for users who choose the hybrid dispute resolution, such as the ArtMed over the standard arbitration. So if you have standalone arbitration, you can't quite achieve the preservation of relationship. And so all of these factors taken together tell us that in the region, there will be a growth of influx of investments coming in, economies will grow, infrastructure spend will grow, along with it, business activity, and along with that, the need for legal services. And the objective of resolving those disputes will, if this plays out, put preservation of relationship between the parties as the top priority. So with this, we looked at the different outreach. So let's start with BRI. It's a very bold project. Whether it fails, whether it succeeds, we don't quite know yet, but it spans 60 jurisdictions, it's long-term, it's on infrastructure, and it's on massive investments. They will need a reliable dispute resolution mechanism to ensure that the investors who bring the money inside, put the investments in these projects, know that it is safe. So over time, we have been engaging with the Chinese market, Chinese officials and our counterparts in China to see whether we can come up with a common platform to help to resolve those disagreements. And so I was in Chongqing earlier this week on the Joint Council for Bilateral Cooperation, the JCBC. The JCBC is the highest level of government-to-government collaboration that we have with the Chinese. And we put legal and judicial cooperation very high on the agenda. But the one takeaway that I had as we visit our counterparts in China, and we brought several lawyers along with us as well, is that their own sense is that the current dispute resolution mechanism that they are subjected to every time a Western corporate tries to invest in China is that it's too Western-centric. It's all based on AAA rules or ICC rules and so on. Not that it's bad, but they don't feel that it is customized to what they might need. Second, they always tell us, is there also room for resolving disputes? Mediation ranks high on the agenda. And it is actually not fortuitous that the Chinese signed up to the SCM within the first wave. I think they really see value in this, and they really see value in having mediation as a way in which it preserves the long-term relationship. And certainly it embodies their own values and the values in which they see business being done. So we've been to China, we've also been to Japan. I just wanted to show you a photograph of, which I found very interesting. When I was in Japan, they told me that they set up a mediation center in a temple. So this is Kodaiji Temple. Outside of the office setting, it creates a sense of vibe, conciliatory, peaceful surroundings, something we can perhaps learn from. We were also in India to see whether we could test the market there and see what positivities there would be. And SIMC has been very progressive. They went to Bangalore and they took in 21 Indian specialist mediators, trained them, accredited them, and they became accredited specialist members of the SIMC. They are now effectively our ambassadors for mediation in India. They are top lawyers, some of them are ex-judges, and they now sing praises of SIMC, and they bring this to their own practice. They insert SIMC clauses into the way in which they draft their agreements as lawyers. Beyond the geographical space, as mediation grows and evolves, what else can we do? I would say we look at the next piece, which is technology. Platforms such as online hearings, negotiations, automated negotiations in the context of mediation, even analytics for the appointment of mediators and arbitrators, or even counsel would be useful. So again, let me share some SIDRA results with you on technology tools. So the survey listed a few examples of technology tools that were used commonly and asked if users found them useful or never heard of before. And I think we had 1/3 say useful, suggesting that the other 2/3 probably never heard of it before. So we can learn from this and I think leverage on technology, use it to develop the practice. A closer look at the respondent profile, which is also interesting, shows that corporate users are more likely to recognize specific technology as useful as compared to lawyers. And I think that reinforces the point I made earlier. And it suggests that there's an opportunity for lawyers to consider greater use of technology in mediation and also meeting and bridging client expectations. Another new growth area for mediation is in the context of investor-state arbitrations and disputes. There's been a growing number of investor-state disputes. As of 2018, there were 942 known treaty-based investor-state dispute settlement cases. 71 new arbitrations were initiated in 2018 alone. And again, also validated by our own SIDRA surveys, at least suggestive of it, almost half of the lawyers who responded have been involved in an investor-state or multilateral investment dispute from 2016 to 2018. So it reinforces what we think, what we hear on the ground, and what we see anecdotally. Arbitration is commonly used in investor-state disputes. Again, I think you see it in the survey, but again, I think you know. But we see a rising interest in investor-state mediation, and I think that was the surprising find from these results. You would have imagined that, two parties, especially two states, would become a lot more entrenched, but I think the converse is probably true, that investor-state disputes, even with investments being appropriated and so on, they look at mediation as something that presents a quick option, cheaper, quicker, and perhaps preserves the long-term relationship. And I think for the investor in a country, there's tremendous value in that. So we see mediation as being more frequently incorporated into investment treaties, often as a preliminary step to arbitration. Obviously, it's a preliminary step to a dispute resolution mechanism because, as I said just now, you can't have mediation exist in vacuum. It sits together with a more conventional, typical way of resolving disputes. So the Energy Charter Conference endorsed a guide on investment mediation, and many institutions have adopted bespoke rules for investor-state mediation, for example, IBA and also ICC, focusing on the skills and qualifications of investment mediators. So there's a specialist group of investment mediators now being trained, familiar with this area of the law and understanding the dynamics of parties behind an investor-state dispute. So for example, the International Mediation Institute, the IMI, has published a set of competency criteria for investor-state mediators. Some other interesting findings from the survey. In terms of selecting a dispute resolution mechanism for investor-state disputes, the top 3 factors were enforceability, impartiality, and political sensitivity. And I think mediation ticks all these boxes. Ad hoc mediation was more frequently used compared to institutional mediation, and only 27% of corporate users indicated that they were very satisfied or somewhat satisfied with the enforcement of outcomes. Bear in mind, this is up to 2018, before SCM. So a gap that we think SCM can fill, and the mediation community as well. So in closing, let me just quickly summarize what lies ahead. You heard what I said about the investments coming in. I think there is increasing globalization. This trend of ignoring or marginalizing multilateralism, I think, will not continue for too long. We need to competency build, we need to build our capabilities, ensure that SIMI, SIMC, SIDRA, the Academy, all come together, work together. And you can be assured that all of this will be undergirded by a progressive legal system that will react to business needs, that will make changes when it's necessary, and that changes, if needed, will come quickly. Because you've seen the experience of how we've done other pieces of legislation. If we need to move on something, we need to fill a lacuna, it will be moved quickly. But ultimately, I think what requires for us to do is to call on all the different players in the mediation community to come together, to work together. I think it's an important part of this puzzle, that we are not seen as a country that has set up the SCM, signed it, and then we cannot get our act together internally. So what to me is important is that internally we are cohesive, pull in the same direction, and find opportunities in the region, if not in the global world.